Chi, Heather, welcome. Great to be here. Welcome to all of you. Again, kudos to the Berkeley Center for Law and Business team, especially our colleague Delia Violante, whose vision, passion has made this conference a reality now in its second year. And again, thank you to the entire SF MoMA team. Just can't imagine a better venue for a conversation like this. So we have a lot to cover. I thought, given the environment that we're in, I would take the privilege of kicking things off with a short poem. Here we go. In the hush of SF MoMA, amidst whispers and intrigue, where art and law entwine their conversation leagues deep, AI in spectral hands craft portraits most unique, a canvas once so warm in cold precision weeps. Attendees muse, their minds caught in a ghostly vision. Art, now born of code, and human touch is missing. A symposium convenes, casting light on the division. Art's new dawn unfolds neath a moon's cold emission. So for those of you that know me, know that I did not write this. My poem would have been, roses are red, violets are blue, art is cool, and so are you. This was written by ChatGPT. So this morning, I asked ChatGPT to create a poem about the Art, Law, and Finance Symposium in the style of Edgar Allan Poe. Did pretty well. So, Chi, you're here from OpenAI, whose product, one of your products, is ChatGPT. Tell us a bit how this works, how your technology creates content.
Yeah, sure. And hi, everybody, and thanks for having us, and thanks for setting this up, and definitely thank you to Delia for all the work. Okay, so but maybe a quick show of hands. How many people are familiar with AI technology nowadays? Okay, so I'll talk about a little bit of the basics, but not spend too much time on it. So essentially, what's happening is, AI has been around for many years, right? Like Deep Blue beat, or Deep Blue beat Kasparov way back in the day, and before that, I think it was a term from the 50s and 60s. But what's really captured imaginations over the last few years is the kind of the rise of these large models, and essentially they can create text, they can create images, they can create code, and a variety of other things. And the way they do it is fairly, it seems very esoteric and magical, but it's essentially like a large-scale statistical mathematical equations and mathematical analysis. They look at a bunch of existing content of whatever form you want to talk about, like text or images or whatever. They read through a bunch of content a few different times. They analyze that content. They learn how to predict something with whatever the content is. Like if it's about text, they're learning to predict the next word that should come after you give it an input a few words. It'll try to finish up your sentence, just like autocomplete on your phone or your email. For image generation tools, they look at a bunch of images. There's different ways that it can be done, but the most popular ones, including DALL-E, which is the tool that OpenAI offers, learns how to de-blur an image, like make this image slightly less blurry. And basically, if you can think about these large models as consisting of like learning from a bunch of data in order to perform some kind of objective, and the objective for text models is fill in the next word. The objective for image models is to predict the next, make this image less blurry or predict the next pixel. But then zooming out a little bit, right? What is actually happening is these are not like cutting and pasting or copying or creating databases of the content. They're not like, there's I think common misconception that it takes a bunch of images and then remixes it and then takes like a portion of a leg from one and a hand from another and makes a drawing of a person or whatever. They're actually learning in a machine sense. They're not learning in a human sense, but it's the most directly analogizable way that we have of describing it. And so it's raised a lot of interesting conversations about what does it mean now to be an artist and to create things? What does it mean if a machine can create a lot of things? To the previous talk, like how are we different than AI generations in the end, right? Like what I am doing right now is technically thinking of the next word to say to you every single time I'm talking, right? And that's kind of what these models are doing. So they raise a lot of interesting and fascinating questions around like humanity and learning and art and creativity. But in the end, it is a bunch of software. It is, large language models are essentially code and a bunch of numbers. And if you break it down that way, like it's not as scary. It is code and numbers that have statistically analyzed a lot of information over time, and then can you create that information, like versions of that information or inspirations from that information.
Thanks, Chi. So we'll take a deeper dive, but I want to turn to Heather and ask you to tell us a story about a couple of things, Zarya of the Dawn and Rose Enigma, which I know you've worked on. So I think that's important to our conversation. Can you catch us up?
Yeah, I guess I will also ask a question. How many people are familiar with copyright law? Okay, I will say the background just a little bit is, so there's a question, so in copyright, in order for something to be copyrightable, it has to be an original work of authorship. And so there's a question about what it means to be original and what it means to be a work of authorship. But that's like what's required. So everything is copyrighted that is copyrightable, it's immediate. But if you want it to be registered, you send it into the Copyright Office, you get it registered, and that's how it works. And that's an automatic, basically it's pretty much automatic. You send it in, it's kind of pro forma, they say yes, contrast to the patent situation. So usually it's very simple, and they do that. So I have a client, Chris Castanova, who was using Midjourney and wanted to make a comic book and decided to make the images for the comic book using Midjourney, which is sort of like another one of these versions of these models that allows for text-to-image and image-to-image creation. Made the comic book, sent it in. Somebody, a friend of theirs that's a lawyer, was like, "It would be so cool if you just submitted this and got the first copyright in a comic book using generative AI." And so Chris thought that was cool and sent it in. And because the Copyright Office just sort of automatically gives them, gave it, didn't know that it was made using Midjourney, and then got about 1,000 calls from reporters about what did they think about the fact that they had given out a copyright for a AI-generated work. That was news to them. And so then there began this process of sending letters to Chris and saying that we're going to revoke this copyright, and you have to show why you are the author of this work. So that was Zarya of the Dawn. That's the original comic book. The short version of why is that their view has been that, and in that situation, that Chris was not the author. So it has to be original work of authorship. Chris was not the author of the images that were created using Midjourney. Chris was the author of the text that they made and the composition and how they put it together, but not the author of the images. And so she could not get a copyright in the book as a whole. And so that was that case. They went back and forth, and in the end, they took back the copyright and said that Chris only had a copyright in it as a compilation, which is actually quite weak. So that was that. I was not involved at that point, and then I became involved when I think Chris was on another panel actually and had talked about how things were changing and how there were these new things called control nets, which were basically like extensions that you could use with Stable Diffusion, and there's a lot more control over how you make things, and that Chris just was continuing to make their art through using all these tools. And so somebody again said, I think that could be copyrightable. It's a different situation. There's a lot more control, and we could talk about what that means. But then I got involved, and we submitted usually you don't put like a cover letter or an explanation with your work, but now you kind of need to with a work that you're using these tools to explain why we think that Chris is the author of this work that Chris created using Stable Diffusion plus control net models. And so that's what we're waiting to hear back from. It's been like 4 months almost, which is a very long time actually for the Copyright Office to take, but they're kind of in the process right now of trying to figure out what they think. They're holding listening sessions. They're going to have a webinar in a couple weeks. They're really not sure. And there's a bunch of different tests that are around basically trying to understand where someone's an author. So that's the story with Chris and Rose, and then the last one is Rose Enigma.
Okay, and tell us about Rose Enigma.
So Rose Enigma, basically the difference is that with Rose Enigma, how many of you guys have used any of these like Stable Diffusion or DALL-E, any of these ones to make images before? Okay.
Give us a primer.
Yeah, so basically like it's truly like it can be very, very straightforward. So you could literally go in, I wish I had like a picture for you, and you just type a prompt, and then you can get a couple of images. So, and that's sort of on the easy end of what you can be able to do. And people can do prompts of vastly different complexity. I can put in a prompt, which is what I would usually do, and say something like, capybara drinking boba, right? It's very simple. I don't really know what's going to happen, but that's like what I get out, and I get out some cute pictures of capybaras drinking something that's kind of like boba. But you can also do things that are super complex and have prompts that are like hundreds of words and explaining what you want it to look like and saying what you don't want, and it just depends. So for Rose Enigma, it's it was a combination of a more specific prompt that gave some more details, but also because Chris has a local copy of a Stable Diffusion model on their computer, they were able to also use these control net models on top of it, which allows you to layer in additional controls over the image. So not only do you put in a textual prompt, Chris drew a picture on paper, took a picture of that picture and scanned it in, and then put that in as another one of the inputs to the model saying, look, I want it to have this structure, and then I want it to have, like, I'm going to give you a textual prompt, but I kind of want you to fill it in with this structure, and then a couple of other things that Chris was able to sort of tweak in order to make it come out. And then we have the image at the end that looks very similar to the image that was the sketch, but has a bunch of additional sort of originality, creativity on it on top of it. So that's sort of Enigma.
And can you summarize a bit the argument that you made, and how much of it is dependent on the kind of the level of the input from the human artist in this case?
Yeah, so it's really not clear yet. So as I said, so the test is whether it's original work of authorship. The question is whether it's a work of authorship. How does the Copyright Office and courts usually decide whether you're the author and that's your work of authorship? Usually it's a pretty straightforward, it's not very hard because the standard is basically, as long as you put in like a little bit of creativity, like a little bit of originality, then you're the author and it's not a big deal and you have a copyright. Though technically speaking, you have a copyright in your creative expression, but it's usually not a big deal. However, in some cases, there are different line of cases where two humans are debating who was the author of a work. So maybe they both contributed to it, and now they want to say that who's the person. And in those cases, the courts are looking much more at who basically controlled the overall artistic vision, who basically had say over the final end product. There's a lot of more like looking into the nitty gritty of what you did in order to find out who's the author, because in the United States, you can't have joint authorship unless there was, basically you kind of had to agree to it. So if you didn't agree to it, and in these cases you're not, that's not gonna be a possibility. So it's sort of like one or the other. And so in these cases, what the Copyright Office has basically said, they've said a couple different things, but one of the things that they have said is that they're effectively going to treat it like it's a dispute between two people about a work. And they're going to say, you're the author. If it was a person on the other side, we would say you're the author, is effectively what's happening. So they're like, how much control did you exert over the image? In the Zarya of the Dawn letter, they were really focused on predictability, which is a sort of separate thing, where they were saying, you cannot be the author of this work because you couldn't have known ahead of time what it was going to look like. And if you can't predict it, you can't be the author of it. And that's like kind of that's not in the cases. And so they've kind of walked that back a little bit, but it's not clear how much. So those are the kinds of things. So we knew going into it that they were going to care about predictability and they care a lot about control. And then we want to be able to say that there is like Chris's creative expression, beyond just the sketch, creative expression shows up in that final image is kind of what you have to do. And so being able to look at the control nets and being able to say, look at all of these things that Chris was able to do in order to kind of control what came out, that makes a difference to the level of control. And then we want to basically make a parallel to photography where, I mean, you almost always get a copyright in your photos, and let's be honest, most of us are just sort of clicking a button, and there's not that much control and not much creative decisions that's making place in those cases. So trying to say this is surely more of all of the things that you require than it is in 99.999% of photos. So that's sort of the high-level version.
Thanks. So, Chi, to my example this morning, I woke up and I had a conversation. I said, draft me a poem about the Art, Law, and Finance Symposium. Then I got a response. I said, make it shorter. Then I got a response. I said, okay, in the style of Edgar Allan Poe. So I exerted some control. There was a conversation. I guess two-part question. First, can you give us just a little bit more understanding of how that worked, kind of the interplay between my commands and what the model was doing?
Yeah, sure. So I think the way I would think about it is these models are learning concepts as they read a bunch of sentences and trying to predict the next word. They are learning that green is associated with color, and so usually green is a color, and so on, things like that. They've probably read stuff from Edgar Allan Poe. They understand what his poetry generally looks like, and then they just start associating different concepts together, right? So if you want a poem, like it understands what art is and understands what a symposium is, and then over time it will be able to just craft something that has those concepts tied together. And so it will create a first draft of a art symposium, a poem about an art symposium. Then as you ask for additional input, or you kind of add different parameters to it, it will, based on, again, it's understanding that it's developed by reading a lot of different things, it will kind of add those different concepts, cut it down. It understands what shorter means. It understands what, Edgar Allan Poe, style looks like generally, and then it can just kind of keep refining it as you work with it over time.
And how does OpenAI think about these issues of ownership and, what's your role in it, and just, share that perspective?
Yeah, I would. So 2 questions of like ownership versus copyrightability. I think copyrightability is the complex legal one. Ownership is fairly straightforward. Ultimately, like we want people to be able to use these things freely, that the way that they see fit. We worked with a couple of different ownership frameworks early on when our first image generation tools came out, and originally we owned it and gave a license to the user. That, after a lot of feedback, we were kind of like, okay, well, I think the users basically want to own this. We hadn't seen significant harm or deep fakes or things like that coming out of it. We granted ownership. So ownership vests with the creator of the image, the person who's inputting the text that gets the image out. Copyrightability, different question, right? Like to Heather's point, copyrightability is essentially how much control did the person exercise over it versus the machine doing all of the work, and that's going to be, I think, much more case by case. But the way I kind of think about it at a high level is that I am also not a poet. I am also not an artist. An artist using these tools, and we've seen many great artists use these tools and come up with just things that I would never be able to do. Like the way I think about it is like these tools let me create art, which is great. Most of the stuff I create probably should not be copyrightable, but the people who are actively good at this stuff and working at it create things that are still very special and unique, and they should somehow be incentivized and rewarded to be able to continue doing that, right? Like there is definitely a huge skill gap and an outcome gap between me and a real artist using these, or me and a real poet, you and a real poet, and that should be recognized somehow, whether it's through full copyright, whether it's a lighter degree of copyright, lots of different variations and places that could go.
And Heather, maybe you can shed some light on this, and we're going to have a deeper dive later today with 2 Berkeley law professors, Professor Samuelson and Manel, and I know they'll touch on these issues quite a bit, including the recent Warhol case. But how do you think then of we've kind of talked about the tension traditionally between 2 humans, but in the case of using these AI models, where let me provide an example. If I was to, whether it's a digital output or my poem, if I said, here's these 10 poets or these 10 artists, derive me something based off of their works, and we're seeing some litigation that kind of connects to this, but how do you think about, or how should we think about kind of the ownership claims of the people that are providing the input into the learning models?
Yeah, I mean, I think like what she said, I think it really is. The problem is, this is what I think. The problem is it should be a case-by-case determination, okay, because it really does make a difference between me saying capybara was boba versus someone who you see these prompts and like these controls where you're doing a lot more, and I think there's a lot more to be said about what they're doing and some sort of that they are the author in a way that I do not personally experience authorship when I say capybara boba, right? Yeah. And so in a different world, I think it would be wonderful if there was a case-by-case analysis once we actually got clear on what we mean by authorship, which we have pretty much no idea what we mean when we talk about it in the cases, because it hasn't really been that much of an issue. The problem is that we don't live in that world. The world that we live in, they're not doing that kind of an analysis on every single thing that's being registered. And so it's actually just hard to know what the rule should be given that reality. I do think that, and I do think that there is a substantial difference, and there are more and more controls that are coming out today where it is becoming more and more like a tool for some artists in the way that Photoshop is a tool. Whereas, and there's still the ability for someone like me to use it without that kind of artistic, but there really is this movement, and I think it will be very unlikely to see that not be copyrighted given where it's going and how many artists are using it. The difference though between the poem one and the visual art one is kind of interesting because I think we have the cases that exist already on this idea of authorship of textual works versus authorship of visual works is just so different because of the history of photography. And because when photography was first invented and we were asking and debating, is this an art form or is this not an art form? Eventually we came out on the and are these copyrightable? Like, is there any, human creativity? You're just taking a picture of the world. When we decided that we were going to give copyrights in photos, then we had to have all these cases we were saying, like, well, why should we? Like, where's the creativity? And if you just apply those cases in visual works like DALL-E, then it's hard to see why they shouldn't be copyrighted. But we've never done something analogous in the textual space because we've never had a tool like a camera where you have some textual work made that's just so much what looks like creativity by something that's not a human.
Yeah.
So we just do treat them different. And I think it would be very surprising if there was convergence because the cases are so different.
Tell us a bit about maybe we in the context of DALL-E, if the data source for it, and or in my example, if Edgar Allan Poe was still with us and he came to you all and said, "You're enabling folks to make iterations of my work," how do you think about kind of the data set and potential contributors to that data set and their ownership claims?
Yeah. This is a interesting and complex topic that a lot of people are talking about right now, including us. And so I think on one hand, there's no law in any country in the world that says you cannot look at something and learn from it, right? And at one level, literally, machines are looking at stuff and learning from it, just like people look at stuff and learn from it. And then when you learn from something and you create something inspired by that, what you learned from, that is okay as long as you're not copying the work or creating something very similar to it. I think that's where the legal basis of where I think you start from. But then you also, want to be we want to be mindful of the current Edgar Allan Poes of the world who come and say, hey, actually, I'm concerned about this. I don't like my art being used by AI models to learn from. I don't like you reproducing things that are similar to my art, et cetera. And so there's been a lot of conversations about this. I think where we currently net out is, we definitely do not want to replace the role of artists. That's not the goal of this. The goal of this is to help people, create what they want to do. Like DALL-E specifically is help creators, be even better at what they do, and then help people who are not creators at all, like myself, be able to take advantage of that. And so one thing that we will be announcing in the near future is that, we're not going to allow generations in the style of living artists, even though it's not legally necessary. I think that's something that we've heard some feedback on, and it's not a use case, honestly, that we see a lot. It's not a use case that we think it's not a use case that we see demand from people, and given concerns from artists, we think that it's appropriate to not support that over time. In terms of whether their art or their content should be used to teach the model in the first place, I think that's something that we're definitely interested in talking about a lot. There is this fine balance of you should allow learning, right? But then the counter argument is maybe these laws were designed for people, for people to learn. Machines operate on a different scale. Machines don't need incentives to create, which is the goal of copyright law. That said, these AI tools are helping accomplish the purpose of copyright law, which is to progress arts and sciences and useful arts, which is pretty accurately falls under, I think, that umbrella. And so we're having a lot of conversation about that. I think the initial reaction is fine. If you don't want it, we will take it out. It's not. In the end, what happens is you need, when you're teaching these models to perform whatever that task is, you need a lot of examples, right? So if you think about the ChatGPT word prediction, it's very easy to say it's just predicting the next word. But if you think about how many possible words can come out of any following sentence, I can say any word in the world right now, and it would I could figure out a way to make it make sense. And so there are an almost infinite number of combinations that could possibly happen. And in order for an AI model to be able to give you one that's useful and appropriate, it has to understand and read a lot of different words, and this applies to images and all those other things as well. And so, because machines don't learn the way that we do. People learn not just by reading words, but listening and being taught and so on. But a machine is essentially trying to learn language by just reading a lot, and so it has to read a lot. But it's not about so much about having to read Edgar Allan Poe specifically, especially if he doesn't want his stuff to be read. It's about we're trying to show it a bunch of words so that it can learn how to predict words, it can learn language, it can learn logic and grammar and vocabulary and so on. And so it's less about any specific source in there, and more about how can it learn language, can it learn how to draw concepts like symposiums and art and so on over time. And so there's definitely, like, I think one of the concerns, we've got to figure out a way to make this scalable. If people say, hey, they don't want this, they don't want their art to be used or looked at or whatever, we have to figure out how to operationalize, how to make that actually happen in practice. But it's something we're definitely open to, and we're having a lot of conversations with rights holders and owners and creators and so on about, like, what is the best way to like kind of be a useful part of this overall creative ecosystem, rather than just like replace it or take over it as a tech company.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that, Gene. I'm curious about the kind of the conversation behind that, and I imagine one concern is a slippery slope. The lyrics of my song, are how did you kind of start there, or just if you can unpack that at all, I think it's really interesting.
How did we start there from, what do you mean?
Of kind of being open to excluding the works of living artists. What does that mean? How are you defining that? And then are you concerned that that opens the door, a slippery slope, to others kind of, because for your model to work effectively, you need access to increasingly more data.
Yeah, that's the fundamental, I think, tension between artificial intelligence learning and models today and creators and content owners. And so I think about it a few different ways. I think if you up level it a bit, what are people really afraid of with AI, right? They're afraid of new technology, but like, what are they really afraid? They're like, people are afraid we're going to be displaced by technology, right? They're afraid that they're going to lose their jobs, or not have a role in what does it mean to be an artist if any machine can draw now, right? And like those kind of fundamental questions. And so if you start from there, it's like, well, how do you kind of address those types of concerns? And OpenAI is not going to solve it on our own. We have lots and lots of conversations. We've spoken to a lot of creators to get this feedback. We speak to a lot of like policymakers and law professors and academics and industry and so on. And so I think we kind of we have these conversations. We learn a lot. We listen a lot. We debate internally what is the right move here. How do you balance the usefulness of these tools, which we hear a lot about. And I think one thing that ChatGPT has given me more appreciation for is I'd say a year or two I worried a little bit that whether AI would really be like a thing, and whether it would be it would be something that the general public, governments, et cetera, would appreciate and want. And I think ChatGPT's popularity and popular other similar tools like that has shown that it is something that is very useful and helpful, and that people do want, but they want it to be done in a way that is that is fair, right? And fairness is a very elusive, a hard concept to define. And so like, first you start with, was it legal? And then you're like, was it like ethical and moral? And then that's where you get into a lot of gray areas. But so it's basically, we parse a lot of those ideas and thoughts. We have a lot of debates internally. We figure out, what are ways that we can actually make this happen in a way that, works for, what our end goal for these systems are. Is like, we want to build something that is a useful, assistant in your lives if you want to use it. We don't want to build something that replaces artists or or books or anything like that. And so you figure out what are the steps that you can take to reach that end goal, and this is basically one of them.
Yeah. Heather, wondering if you can comment more broadly. I mean, it's interesting. Has this space develops? I think we think almost of the AI models, the ChatGPT, Anthropic, other platforms, companies, Microsoft. How do you think about their role in this, and as it develops?
On the ethical side?
Legal and ethical.
I mean, on the legal side, they don't really have a choice. So that's just going to play out. I think on the ethical, I do think one thing that is positive is that so I've worked with several of these different companies and different people. And I do think that there is a genuine interest in understanding and trying to make good decisions about this stuff. And I do think it's very difficult. And I mean, even just thinking about when we're talking about this question of taking out data, I think oftentimes there's this idea that like, oh, we should just take, if we just take it out, that's like a better thing. But in reality, like there's also some downsides to that too, because if you have a certain group of people who have decided that they don't want their data to be basically the model to be trained on it, then their voice in some sense is not going to be represented in what your understanding of what the output will be, right? So if you just train on Reddit, then you're gonna have a particular picture of the world that would be different than if you trained on stuff that included not Reddit, right? Like women and like people who are happy, And so I think that though there's like a thing about that you have to think about those kinds of consequences, and there are a lot of those that make it, truly difficult questions, and the trade-offs are not so obvious. So I think I think that they are trying, and I think that it is important to continue to try, because I think we saw in the last, I was just starting at Google when when Google was becoming sort of a huge thing, and the way that we thought about technology then, I think we've seen that some things happen that we probably would do it slightly differently.
Yeah.
And I think that people are very cognizant of that now, and I think people are much more willing internally to sort of proceed with some more caution, and I think that's good.
And then on the ethical side of things, it's interesting to your example of Google, and if we think about kind of social media and platforms and what's happened around content moderation and kind of the tension between regulators and platforms to self-moderate and set up governance structures. AI seems, both on the conversation we're having around ownership, but also there's broader questions. You mentioned job displacement. There's concerns around the existential survival of mankind and AI. We laugh, but I think folks are taking that very seriously. And so I guess to both of you, what have you learned, or what are you seeing about how industry is addressing these in connection with regulators, with courts? What sorts of structures, what have you learned to address these issues that go beyond law? And so, you've given us a bit, Che, about what you're doing, but can you elaborate?
Yeah, it'll take about 3 hours, but I guess
it's a big question. Yeah, it's important.
Yeah. So if you kind of like how are we thinking about regulation? Is that your question, or how?
If you think about the issues around AI, and we have certainly one here around ownership and creativity, but other issues include, displacement of workers, safety, the survival of mankind, and certainly regulators have concerns about that. They're slow moving. We're starting to see the industry address this stuff independently, and the history of that and other examples, social media and content is maybe not been the most successful. So how are you approaching this landscape and addressing these ethical, legal issues in absence of clear regulation or guidance from governments?
Yeah. So I'll start from two different concepts. The first is AI has a pretty bad brand problem. I don't know if you guys have noticed. I think we were talking about this the other day, and every pop culture reference to AI. If you think about every movie that you've seen about AI, I would say 99.9% of them are negative on the outcome of what it can be. Right? It's like Terminator and Skynet and things like that. And then we were struggling to think about a positive example, and I think came up with like Short Circuit. I don't know if you guys remember that movie. Yeah, Johnny Five, and then Star Trek maybe, and just it's like a very limited sample size compared to all the other movies about existential AI dread. So I think there is this underlying fear about AI because we as people have amazing imaginations, and we have imagined over the years technology, displacing us and hurting us and, taking over us, et cetera, et cetera. And that almost kind of like, there's like a feedback loop that happens because we came up with these cool ideas, and then now like, these are in stories and on the internet, and then like our AI models like read these things as well, and then they say, oh yeah, this is like something that people are afraid of. And so there's kind of this general fear, I think, right? And then there's and then on the other side, there's the growing understanding that these are actually useful, very useful, helpful tools, right? Like when I talk about this, I actually don't like the term generative AI, and I say this a lot, but it implies that this is just here to spit out words or spit out images for you. That's not really the end goal. Like what we at OpenAI are doing is we're trying to develop a real AI, like something that is actually like a smart robot or whatever, whatever term you want to use, but something that will be able to help you in your life, right, in your everyday life. And so, or it can help, progress scientific research, or any other kind of or boost economic productivity, any other kind of positive goal that you can imagine. And so, in order to do that, what we've done is we've taken a few steps, right? Like, first thing is we built a system, a model, but essentially built a computer program that can kind of understand you, right? And so once it can kind of understand you, then it can understand what you want. It can start taking basic actions on your behalf, right? So we start out with basic actions being answer your questions, or draw a picture for you, or write code for you. And we've introduced features that include things like you can access the internet for you. It can go book a plane, book a restaurant reservation or a plane ticket or whatever. And so it's kind of like Alexa or Google Home, but the initial promise of those digital assistants, but they weren't that great. I came from Amazon, so I can say that. And so, but they weren't really smart in that sense. Like they don't actually understand what you want. These models don't really understand what you want either, fundamentally at a human understanding level. If you really want to parse words, but it can give a pretty good facsimile of what you want by responding in a way that is statistically correlated to your request. And so, maybe that's intelligence. Who knows? And so now, if you have something that is very useful, and then you have something but is feared by a lot of people for both good and kind of more far-fetched reasons, then it's kind of like, well, what is the middle ground that you can bridge the concerns and the upside? And that is a lot of internal debate. That is a lot of engagement with policymakers and legislators and regulators. There's a lot of conversations with artists and creators. And when we came out with DALL-E, we spent a lot of time talking to a lot of different artists, both before and after, about hopes, dreams, fears, concerns, and just events like this. I learn a lot of these events. That's why I do them. I really appreciate the opportunities. And just synthesizing, what do we think makes sense, and then we come up with our thesis for what makes sense. But that isn't the right answer, right? Like that is just our perspective, and then we try to go out there, share our perspective, learn more, call on governments to think about this with us and help us think through these issues and problems. Think about ways that we can voluntarily kind of make changes or advances or other areas. And so it's like, I think it's a slow process of, hey, we know we have something really useful. We know we have something that raises a lot of concerns. There are a lot of different, every group in society is impacted or will be affected or is concerned about it or is excited about it in some way. And then how do you kind of get together all those different issues and concerns? How do you address them one by one? And then it's a matter of how do you work through each of these very hard issues.
Yeah. I saw you speak about a month ago, and you had given reference, I think, on this point about how this idea of AI ending humanity is so prevalent in science fiction, but then that data shows up. That's part of the data that OpenAI, ChatGPT is using. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So, so like I said, we are the ones we have great imaginations. Like we are creators, we are makers. We came up with these, cool stories. All these stories, right? Like every story over time has been told by a human and will continue to be. And so, but we've told stories about how robots can take over the world. And then there's a lot of text like that on the internet. These systems are trained on the internet about how robots, there's stories about robots taking over the world. And so if you talk to a lot of AI models today and you ask them about some of these scenarios, they can take the persona on of a robot that wants to take over the world because if that's what you're looking for. But so if you think about that loop, it's essentially our own fears, concerns, dreams, hopes projected into this machine that is kind of returning statistically correlated words and ideas based on what you're asking for. And so if you're asking for how is it that what is the end future of like a negative future of AI? It is basically what we are afraid of as people, right? Because essentially these reflect human discourse and conversation and thinking on it. And so that was an interesting observation that a friend of mine, I was having a conversation with a friend about these fears and like, how did we go from, hey, this is interesting software to like, okay, one day this is going to end the world? Because there's not a logical path there, right? And there's not even the way that these existential concerns, and this is my personal opinion, by the way, there are people at OpenAI who disagree, but the way that there's not like a logical progression of how that will happen. There's like a lot of like what ifs, but like you can what if anything, right? Like that is part of the greatness of our imagination. You can what if any scenario in the world, and so I think that was just the observation that Adam's referring to.
I appreciate that. So back to art. Curious for the audience, when I read my poem, how many of you, be honest, had a sense that this was AI generated? That's pretty good. Okay, but still, a few of you.
It's a smart group.
It's a smart group, and there were some cues that I may have done that, and many of you know me. But it looks like I fooled a few of you, and I think it's helpful to learn about how the technology works, because I think we see it's not necessarily a huge leap, and certainly there's always been tools. I'm sure there was controversy around Adobe Photoshop and its impact on the creation of art. But the leap from a consumer perspective, it's pretty massive, right? Like your example of the, what's the animal called?
Oh, capybara.
Capybara drinking boba. Prior to DALL-E or these other AI models, it would take me, hundreds of hours to do anything, even using Photoshop, et cetera. And so I can, ask for this image and get something that's pretty astonishing and looks rather complete. And so I guess, can you speak to that a bit? Just, I think that's part of the reason why we're all exploring AI. It's such a big part of this, that maybe the technology, the leap isn't what we think it is, but as consumers, it seems incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good observation, and it's a very valid point, which is for ChatGPT, it's based on something called GPT-3 that we released in 2019, a few years ago, and it's actually been available for a lot of people to use, anyone to use, in a more technical format through an API and application programming interface. And so, but that underlying technology has been around for a while. And so, all ChatGPT it's basically that technology, basically tweaked in order to act more conversational and sound more conversational, and then some features built around it to be able to refer back to prior parts of the conversation. But that tech has actually been around for a while. I think people in the AI field understood it, and some adjacent technology fields. It definitely was not in the general public discourse. And so when we released ChatGPT, we were a little bit surprised. We were not expecting the kind of wave of feedback that we got and uptake on ChatGPT, but I think it does speak to how useful and interesting and cool these tools are, and it speaks to how the fear that and concerns that people do have around AI. And I think we've been talking about AI for a very long time, even concerns around bias and fairness and et cetera have been, we've been having conversations about it for a decade or more. But it's really captured the public imagination since ChatGPT. And I think one of the reasons is, it's widely available. I think previous AI models have not just generally been available to the public. And there is some intentionality behind the way we think about it, which is, these systems are probably going to get more and more powerful, and TBD, where that caps out. But as they get more powerful, and there's, it's important that society and we all have a chance to think about it, and how do we want to handle it, and what do we want to do with this type of technology? Where do we want it to go? And if you in some theoretical world where you come out with a fully formed real AI and just throw it on the world, that's not a good outcome either. Right now, what we have is very smart prediction machines essentially, and so at this point where they have a lot of drawbacks and potential harms, but there's not really a chance of existential crisis or end of humanity worries. We think these are good ways to help people understand and kind of think through and help society think through what should the reaction to these be? How should we respond? And so we do release kind of iterations on what we do. We came out with DALL-E 1 before DALL-E 2. DALL-E 2, with the very well-known one, was released last year, but a couple years before that, we had announced DALL-E 1, which is a very just basic image generation tool that wasn't that great, but it was still mind-blowing at the time. I saw that was one of the reasons I was very interested in this whole area, because that seemed so cool, right? So we kind of think about this iterative deployment step where you come out with something new and interesting, you make sure you kind of share it with the world, you engage with people on it, you engage with policymakers and regulators on it, and think about, hey, does this make sense? What else should we be doing here? We want to take feedback. We want to do something that is helpful for everyone in the end. We're not in this to maximize the number of images or the number of words that we sell. And so as we kind of come up with new versions, advancements of the technology, we do everything and share it publicly, get feedback on it, and then kind of work off of that.
Yeah. So Heather, wondering if you can close us out. I think your work is really interesting. I know it's something a lot of our law students would be interested in. And so tell us a bit more what you're working on, what you're keeping your eye on. It sounds like you're waiting to hear back from the trademark office on Rose Enigma, but tell us a bit more what's keeping you up at night.
I guess the thing I would say at the end is just, to go back to this topic about why do we care so much right now and why has it exploded in this way and sort of what these choices are. I think a lot of the reason is like a non-legal reason, which is just that it's the power of anthropomorphizing a certain technology. And if you think about, I think, the subjective experience that I at least have from using something like DALL-E versus something like a ChatGPT, it's a very, very different experience, right? I don't think if there was no such thing as a text one where it's talking to you in the first person, right, in using words that we associate with human understanding, right, and speaking about I understand my feel, like I don't have feelings, but here's the view, right? There's a lot of these user choices that have been made, which make it like a much more enjoyable experience to interact with, but at the same time, it does play into the stories that we've been told about what the sort of doomsday is going to be, which is that these things have these personalities and their consciousness and they're going to take over the world and like kill us all, right? So, but it's really because of that, these user design choices. So to me, it's kind of interesting to think going forward, will that change? And the more that this technology is expanded and made more powerful, if we change that experience, how much would our understanding and how much would we sort of import all of the stories that we've been told about, the Frankenstein, but also just the idea of it taking over? That I think is something that I'm sort of interested in, which is not really a legal thing as much as just the sort of watching what people care about and how, like, basically what we're going to do on a regulation front because of our basically treating it like a person.
Yeah. And then on the legal side, what are you keeping your eye on?
The copyright thing I think is really interesting. I think it's just super hard. I think the authorship question is, it's just not resolved, and so I am just sort of waiting for the Copyright Office to respond. And I think inevitably there will just be the cases, and just seeing what the courts say and trying to figure this out, and seeing about how will we treat this compared to the history of the treatment of photography, and will we diverge or not. And I think having a more meaningful conversation about the incentives and why we have copyright protection to begin with, and whether or not we are willing to sort of backtrack, I think, on the expansion of it, if this will be the impetus for that or not, I think is interesting. And I think on the other legal side, it's just, there's just so much regulation now that people are thinking about. And particularly, I sort of am interested in this provenance question and how we're trying to basically make technical tools to allow us to deal with legal issues, and seeing how that plays out.
Okay. Well, Chi, you've been so generous with kind of giving us a behind-the-scenes look. Can you share anything about what we can expect in ChatGPT 20 or DALL-E 30?
No. No. I think that we should all just expect the progression of what I'm talking about earlier, which is we want to build a useful assistant, right? And we're going to keep improving the way that the assistant can understand what you want. We're going to keep improving the tools that, the actions that it can take on your behalf. Lots and lots of questions and concerns around safety and risks, and what should it not do and what can it do. And this is where we are, very, very open to input, and we do get a lot of input from a lot of different groups. But over time, I think the vision is going to be, we something that can understand you, something that could go do stuff for you, something that can act as an intelligent, experienced subject matter expert in whatever area that you want, that can go and help you do research, or help you organize your stuff, or help you schedule your day-to-day life, or so on. And I think everything, you can kind of see a clear path of like the pieces that we're trying to put together to get to that. And we have an inkling of what a useful thing that you can write a poem for a talk that you're about to give can be, and maybe like in the future, it'll help you write the talk and help you give the talk in ways that I think we still have to preserve the human aspect of it too, and so that's kind of where we want to go and where we plan to go.
Well, homework for everyone. Make sure you stay for the entire day, but I think these issues will be addressed more deeply during our session with the law professors. And then make sure you go and watch the documentary Terminator, which is excellent. And then I also, for those of you that want to take a deeper dive on the technology, the ethical and legal issues, I oversee executive education at Berkeley Law. My colleague Jim, if you can wave your hand, is here. Jim oversees our AI Institute. This is now going to be our 5th year of the program. I imagine this year will be especially popular popular, but it's a 2-day convening, 3-day convening on issues around everything we talked about and more. We're going to play with some of the technology, faculty from across the Berkeley campus. It will be, Jim, do we have dates? November 1st through 3rd. So if you're interested, you'll probably get emails from us, but also go talk to Jim today. So Chi and Heather, thank you so much for your time. This was a lot of fun. I'll turn it back over to Delia.
Thank you, guys.